Imagine a country where the people you would normally expect to run from the law end up becoming the law itself. That is what happened in Russia. Gangsters traded their tracksuits for government suits, and the criminal world slowly turned into something corporate. Loyalty, fear, and profit replaced the idea of law and order. Corruption did not disappear with the Soviet Union's collapse. It adapted and grew stronger. For more than 70 years, Soviet leaders controlled nearly every part of daily life. When the system fell apart in 1991, the rules fell apart with it. Banks were sitting on piles of rubles that suddenly lost their value overnight. Factories that once produced jets, refrigerators, or anything else had no customers, no direction, and often no leadership at all. Oil refineries kept working, but no one knew who actually owned the oil coming out of them. On paper, the workers owned everything. In reality, power went to whoever showed up with enough muscle to take it. It felt like the Wild West. Police officers had not been paid in months. Government offices were full of people waiting for orders that never came. A power vacuum swallowed the entire country and everything around it. There were billions in assets, but no one who could enforce rules or ownership. Into that void stepped the only people who still knew how to work as a coordinated group: criminals. Russia had always had its own elite circle of thieves with strict codes and long traditions, shaped in Soviet prisons. But after 1991, they were suddenly joined by angry young men who had fought in Afghanistan, who knew weapons and tactics. They were joined by bodybuilders, former KGB agents who excelled at surveillance and blackmail, and even athletes. If you were strong, bold, or desperate enough, you could make a living. Crime was the one industry that still paid. These criminal leaders provided something the failing government could not. They offered violence like a business service, and they kept people in line far more effectively than the courts or police. Moscow's streets turned into battlegrounds. St. Petersburg's ports were cut into territories like slices of a cake. Vladivostok looked as if it had survived artillery fire. Car bombs exploded in daylight. Businessmen were shot in cafes. Bodies appeared in rivers or inside burned-out cars. By the mid-1990s, Moscow was drowning in contract killings. Anyone could be eliminated for a fee, and the fee was not high. With the average salary hovering around $100 a month, murder became a cheap and booming business. To really understand the chaos of that era, imagine living in a place where the most frightening figure you could think of was not a character in a film, but someone you might see in the newspaper. Alexander Solenik became something like a dark legend. Every week brought a new story about him, another prison escape, another impossible feat of marksmanship, another fight where he took down several hardened inmates using nothing more than a shovel. No one knew which stories were true, and that uncertainty only added to his reputation. He did not go after civilians. He saw himself as a professional. He hunted the untouchables. In one hit, he killed a major crime boss who stepped out of a bulletproof car with elite bodyguards. Solenik shot the man from hundreds of yards away, then picked off several guards before disappearing. On another job, he walked into a crowded nightclub, past the bouncers, and took out a rival commander so quickly that most people did not hear it over the music. Crime bosses began changing cars and restaurants constantly. They slept in new apartments every night because the police could not protect them and the state had no real authority left. The only real power belonged to whoever could afford killers like Solenik. At first, regular businessmen hired gunmen like him out of necessity. In a city where a business dispute could end in gunfire, hiring a professional felt like installing a stronger lock on your door. But it did not take long for people to realize something. It was safer to work under the protection of the mob than to hire random shooters. Pay the Mafia once, and your competitors backed off. Pay twice, and the Mafia practically owned you, but you were alive. Oddly, the system worked. Criminal groups offered protection from other criminals. They enforced contracts. They settled disputes. You could take a case to court and deal with delays and bribes, or you could go to the local crime family and get a solution in a week. Maybe the solution involved a threat or a beating, but it was still a solution. These crime families built networks of informants, lookouts, and corrupt police. They collected taxes. They funded improvements in their neighborhoods. They provided order in a country where the government no longer could. By the mid-1990s, the smarter gangsters realized they could make more money by acting like business owners instead of simple extortionists. Killing someone for a quick payout made less sense than keeping them alive and earning steady money from them. A businessman you controlled was more valuable than a businessman you buried. Groups like the Izmailovo organization in Moscow followed this logic. They transformed from rough street crews into business empires with restaurants, casinos, import companies, and nightclubs. Their leader, Anton Malevsky, dressed like a Western executive and ran his organization like a corporate boardroom, albeit one where failure could cost you your life. Russian organized crime was becoming corporate. But this transformation did not come peacefully. In 1996, American businessman Paul Tatum was locked in a dispute with his Russian partner over a luxury hotel. He was invited to a meeting and instead received a burst of bullets from a submachine gun in a crowded metro station. No one claimed to have seen anything. Around the same period, journalists investigating corruption were being killed. Dmitry Kolodov died when a briefcase he believed contained evidence exploded in his hands. Dozens more journalists were targeted throughout the decade. Politicians, too, faced deadly risks. Reformist Galina Starovoitova was shot in her own building. While the killings continued, the organizations behind them grew more sophisticated. They laundered money across continents. Billions flowed through Western banks in schemes that were so complex they seemed almost artistic. They built relationships with Italian mob families, Colombian drug cartels, and Asian crime syndicates. They brought in accountants, lawyers, and former intelligence officers to run operations. The biggest of them, the Solontsevskaya Brotherhood, even had a leadership council and regional managers. Its leader, Sergei Mikhailov, behaved like a CEO who held life and death in his hands. By the end of the 1990s, criminal organizations had everything the Russian government lacked: loyalty, money, structure, and discipline. What happens when a weak government faces an underworld this strong? The answer showed up in the late 1990s in the form of a former KGB officer named Vladimir Putin. Russia was exhausted. The economy had collapsed. Ordinary people were selling furniture just to buy groceries. A brutal war in Chechnya had spilled violence into Russian cities. Putin had spent years in intelligence work and local government in St. Petersburg. He knew the criminal networks, and they knew him. When he promised to restore order, people were desperate enough to believe him. A series of apartment bombings killed hundreds, and officials blamed Chechen terrorists. Putin responded with a simple message. He would hunt the attackers everywhere, even, in his own words, in the toilet. The phrase became a crude slogan. By the end of 1999, Boris Yeltsin resigned and named Putin acting president. By early 2000, Putin had won the election. Some investigators suggested the bombings might have been staged, but they died before they could prove anything. What mattered was the image Putin projected. He looked like someone who could impose order. But when Putin talked about restoring order, he did not mean ending corruption. He meant bringing it under state control. He used a familiar strategy. If you cannot destroy a network, you take it over. The oligarchs who became rich during the 1990s were given a clear choice. Support the Kremlin and keep your fortune, or challenge it and lose everything. Most of them fell into line. Those who did not faced prison, exile an unexplained death. The killings continued into the 2000s. Journalists like Anna Politkovskaya were murdered. Former intelligence officers who spoke out, like Alexander Litvinenko, were poisoned with rare radioactive elements. Opposition figures like Boris Nemtsov were shot in public places under mysterious circumstances. The line between state violence and organized crime disappeared. The government did not eliminate the mafia. It absorbed the mafia's methods. And when critics fled abroad, the reach of these networks followed them. London became a new battleground. Wealthy Russians died under suspicious circumstances, jogging collapses that later showed traces of rare toxins, falls from windows, sudden heart attacks among people who had recently criticized the Kremlin. Sergei Skripal and his daughter were poisoned with a nerve agent so dangerous it required state facilities to manufacture. Russian agents caught on camera claimed they were simply tourists visiting a cathedral. What made all this even more unsettling was the combination of old Soviet spy tactics with the brutality of the 1990s criminal underworld. Russia denied involvement every time, even when the evidence was overwhelming. By the 2010s, the Russian state and Russian organized crime were no longer separate forces. They had merged. Government ministries were run by people with criminal histories. Intelligence agencies handled extortion, assassinations, and business intimidation. Cyber criminals were allowed to operate freely as long as they targeted enemies of the state. Ransomware gangs attacked hospitals, schools, and companies around the world, protected as long as they avoided Russian targets. When the Kremlin needed them, they acted like patriotic volunteers. On the ground, oligarchs controlled industries the way mob bosses controlled neighborhoods. Yevgeny Prigozhin went from serving food to commanding the Wagner Group, a private army fighting Russia's wars in Syria and Ukraine. He also ran massive propaganda operations online. His power came entirely from his relationship with Putin. When he challenged that power with a brief revolt, his plane fell from the sky. The lesson was simple. In Putin's system, betrayal ends the same way it always did in the criminal world. Dozens of wealthy figures have died in strange accidents, many after criticizing the government or the war. Windows, balconies, and sudden illnesses have become almost predictable causes of death. Today, Russia's security agencies act like mafia clans. Their loyalty is to the man in charge, not to the country. The techniques used to control Moscow's underworld have become the techniques used to run the state. And for many Russians, this still feels better than the chaos of the 1990s. What makes this moment unique is not corruption itself. Other countries have powerful crime syndicates. Some have governments that steal from their people. But never has a nuclear power blended these elements so completely. Russia has become something unprecedented, a mafia state on the scale of a superpower. It took 30 years to reach this point. The collapse of the Soviet Union created chaos. From that chaos rose a new system, where criminals did not need to hide. They became the ones writing laws, running industries, and shaping foreign policy. The real warning lies in how easily it happened. Bit by bit, people accepted shortcuts in exchange for stability. Over time, laws were replaced by loyalty. And once that transformation was complete, the people at the top no longer needed the shadows. They could operate from the Kremlin itself, wearing suits instead of tracksuits, following the same rules they always had. If you want to understand how one man played the long game to turn that power into an empire, watch how Putin went from a KGB officer to Russia's president, or explore the next story.